After, after Major Italy took part in the bombing of Hiroshima, he refused to march in the Heroes Parade or accept a hero's pension. Desperate to prove he was not a hero, he started holding up banks and forging checks in an effort to send money to the children of Hiroshima. His exploits made him world famous, and he stirred up every shade of opinion, from Colonel Tibbets, who called him a traitor, to Gunther Anders, who thought madness was the only sane reaction. This play follows Italy's wild ride from ace World War II pilot to inmate of a maximum security mental hospital and witness of present-day US defense policy. It is both urgent and relevant as the world hovers dangerously once more on the brink of nuclear war. I'm Sajay Samuel, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Greg Eghigian about questions raised by this play Fallout, written by Mary Gage and directed by Elaine Meder-Wilgus, both mutual friends. Now, academics are a predictably boring bunch, and we tend to title even our conversations. The title of today is Madness in the Nuclear Age. And I can't think of anyone better than Greg with whom to have this conversation. Though I've known him for many years, we were just discussing how COVID has prevented us from meeting as frequently as we once did. I'd rather read a blurb of who he is and then allow him to expand more. Greg Eghigian is the professor of history at Penn State University, where he specializes in the history of science and medicine. He has written extensively on the history of mental health and psychiatry and serves on the editorial board of the professional periodical Psychiatric Times. His published work includes The Corrigible and the Incorrigible, Science, Medicine, and the Convict in 20th Century Germany. He's edited The Rutledge History of Madness and Mental Health and From Madness to Mental Health, Psychiatric Disorder and Its Treatment in Western Civilization. So that said, the question of madness in the nuclear age seems to me a perfect sort of setting in which to invite Greg. And perhaps, Greg, you can give us a sense of the arc of your work more than simply what appears at the back of a blurb.
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, I guess if I had to sort of describe generally my kind of interest when it comes to writing, research, teaching, it's been a fascination with, a curiosity about the history of how societies have understood certain people, certain behavior, certain things as marginal, outsiders, abnormal, pathological, criminal, things like that. And so much of what I have written about and I study is that sort of process and who's involved in it, the different sort of historical actors that play a role in drawing up those definitions but also the kinds of institutions that get built that sort of police those boundaries and reinforce them over time.
Yeah. So one of the, I don't know whether you did, but I happened to attend an early reading of Fallout in a previous incarnation. And I think the buzz of those of whom listened to that reading was Italy actually mad? Was he just feigning madness, which is what Colonel Tibbets accused him of? Or was he consigned to the asylum to be kept out of polite society? It was a matter of convenience, regardless of whether he was mad or not. Which then raises the question that you have done so much work to clarify. What are the criteria, or how does this operate? How do people get named mad or not? How is, it seems to me, a historical category, a socio-historical category. It's not, madness is not a thing that persists unchanged over time. So could you speak a little more about precisely that dynamic by which people get, certain behaviors get called mad, certain people get called insane, and so on?
Yeah. So the question you were all discussing and debating as you were talking about that is one that comes up a lot. And from a historian standpoint, I often warn people about how difficult it is, if not downright impossible it is, to establish whether some historical person or actor was in fact suffering from this disorder or that disorder, or not suffering from a disorder. It's as one doctor once said to me, it's hard enough to diagnose somebody who's sitting right in front of you and you're having a conversation with them. Says it's even more difficult when you're dealing with somebody who lived maybe 20 years, 50 years, 100, 300 or 3,000 years ago. So that's one of the difficulties we often have. The other difficulty is the one you talk about, which is that a lot changes. There is every reason to appreciate and acknowledge the fact that this phenomenon, whatever we want to call it, the name has changed, and the names have changed over the centuries. Mental illness, madness, insanity, lunacy, the list goes on. That this is a phenomenon that has been described and analyzed and labeled certain things in certain ways, dependent on the context. If you go back to the ancient world or the medieval world, by and large, what they called madness was something that was, on one hand, fairly capacious, but on the other hand, was fairly uniform. That there wasn't an idea that there were, hundreds or thousands of forms of madness, but oftentimes the argument was that there was really maybe just one or two. And of course, we live in an age in which there now, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, are hundreds of disorders. And so that's one of the changes that goes on. But arriving at this question of how people are deemed to be mad is we have to realize there are multiple actors in any situation, any historical period of time. First of all, is going to be that in common parlance, there is an understanding, it seems very clear historically, that in what we might call just average everyday folk knowledge, people accept the fact that there are states of being, states of mind, or states of one's soul in many cases, that in which people are disordered, people are not quite right with themselves. And moreover, that this is a state of being that many people who are deemed to be mad themselves say, I am mad. I am suffering from this state. So there's that going on. There's a phenomenological dimension to it. But then on top of that, what you have is then you have various kinds of authority figures who step into the fray to say that this represents this, that, or the other thing. And that those might be doctors who, of course, have been involved in this issue for centuries. It may be, in fact, some sort of other kind of public official. It could be a health officer. It could be a police officer, things like that. So there are all these other kinds of figures who step into this. And so in any given situation, all sorts of institutions and people end up playing a role in all of these things. So it's not terribly simple.
Right. I'd like to pull on the two threads, but a bit later, the thread of institutional conditions by which somebody is labeled or named disorderly or disordered or mad or insane, and then the moment of self-recognition as well, the acknowledgement of, because both of these I think show up in the play. But I'd like to get to that later, before which, particularly because of the historical work you've done and your familiarity also with 19th and 20th century psychiatry and medicine and mental health, I thought we could explore the sort of the register at which madness appears in the post-war period along perhaps three registers. I'm a bit of an accountant when it comes to 1, 2, 3. So it impresses me that the sort of infrastructure for the nuclear age, intellectual infrastructure is not simply the making of the bomb, but it was also the style of reasoning that animates and shapes the question of nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, public policy regarding nuclear weaponry, right? And this is preeminently what gets called game theory, which is a mathematical formalization of a kind of abiding paranoid distrust of one another. Human relations get transformed into what some of us have, what has become very popular in academic circles, rational choice theory, which highlights the fact that the way people deal with each other is on the ground of an abiding distrust, and hence the classical case of the prisoner's dilemma, where to cooperate would be the best thing for two prisoners, but in fact, because they can't trust being ratted out, they end up worse off than if they had to cooperate. This logic, enshrined in a kind of mathematics, which gives it credence and sort of power, underwrites what will become mad, mutually assured destruction. So what I'd like to explore with you first is, if we can, is mathematical reason, which is considered the sort of high point of being reasonable, ends up encoding something that I think is manifestly unreasonable, i.e., a mutual paranoia in governing human relations.
Yeah.
And the guy behind that, in part, was John Nash. And I thought maybe you could speak to him a little bit.
I mean, general. Well, it's an interesting question because, right, that there is, as we know, there's been some really fabulous work on the history of the kind of ways of thinking about rationality, right? During the Cold War, during this period of nuclear holocaust as a specter hovering over really all sort of international relations that takes place in immediately after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? The interesting thing about this, right, is that what goes on here is among a lot of policymakers is a question about certainty. It's a question about decision making, not just who's making decisions, but in the wake of a world in which a mistake on the international scene when it comes to nuclear weapons has catastrophic consequences and immediate consequences, right? It becomes incumbent upon people at the time to start saying, how do we deal with mistrust, with misunderstanding, miscommunication? Can we find a way out of the possibility that this is going to be the reason why the world ends with a bang and not a whimper, right? What people come up with, or what some academics start to come up with, is exactly what you described. Finding ways to create a more rationalized way of solving these issues, of making decisions in a way that will avoid these kinds of these quandaries of miscommunication and misunderstanding. And that's the backdrop to things like, as you described, game theory, rational choice theory. It's based on this idea that what the problem is that human beings are flawed. What we need to do is take some of those more emotive aspects, those irrational elements out of the formula, add, again, as you say, these sort of objective measures that come from mathematics and the like, and bring those to the fore. A good example of this from the Cold War is a story that's told about the Soviet space program, manned space flight of the Soviet program and the cosmonauts. So apparently, as the story goes, some of those first cosmonauts go into the cabin, they start playing around with the equipment that the engineers have built, and they find out that there is absolutely no human override functions that are given to them. And they're told, well, the engineers have decided that you, in fact, can't be trusted. You're going to make mistakes, so everything is going to be automated in the hands of these computers. And apparently, the cosmonauts, first of all, they didn't like the idea of basically being mere passengers, but they did not like the idea that their fate, their lives would be in the hands of automatic functions. And so they basically said, we're going on strike. We're not playing. You give us the ability to override that. And they did eventually do that. But that's a good example of this kind of situation in which the human dimension is trusted. And so this, as you referred to it, what seems to be built into all of this is really this sense of distrust, and, as you put it, a kind of paranoia. And I think the thing we've got to talk about when you talk about this kind of development, this innovation in thinking about rationality as a tool that can be defined in some ways, it was understood to be these sort of game theories and game approaches were functioning both prescriptively and descriptively. Right? The idea was that people do these things, this is how people behave, but also this is the way we're going to do things when we arrive at policy, because what we're going to do is we're going to make it better. We're going to make it better. And so both of those things actually do play out in the world of psychiatry as well. And that's something we can chat about, if you will.
Yeah. I find also intriguing and interesting to pursue this line a little more, that if rationality has its common sort of sense of means end, and given the end, how best do I get there? And this is what game theoretic function or game theoretic characterizations of rationality are about. We have the objective function, we know what we want, and this is the best way to get there. It's the cheapest, most economical, most sensible way to achieve that end. What gets left out is the end itself reasonable, right? So insofar as this style of thinking, means end thinking, begins to expand to cover all forms of reasoning, what gets thrown into the shadow is whether one should have nuclear bombs, for example. Instead, we say, we face an existential threat, how best do we deal with it? And that slow expansion of rationality over reason, if reason is also a thinking through ends, what is the purpose, what is the point? The slow expansion of means end, instrumental thinking, vis-a-vis a reflection on ends itself, is promoted by the expansion of this kind of logic, mathematical logic, into many areas of study in the academy, and then from there outside, including psychiatry, medicine, accounting, economics, policy, and so on. Right?
Yeah.
Could you speak a little more about how society is affected by, or ideas of mental health are affected?
Yeah, I mean, probably if I had to pick one figure who I think embodies this and really took this issue on, it would be the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing. R.D. Laing. Laing in the early 60s becomes quite fascinated with game theory. He before this, he had actually, you brought up this term existential. He becomes, actually his early work was very deeply influenced by existentialist philosophy, like Sartre and others. And he's very interested in how people become alienated from themselves and from others in the process of living their lives in modern society. But soon after he explores that, he becomes fascinated with communications and becomes more and more aware that when he deals with patients, and he worked principally with some very severely psychiatrically ill individuals who are suffering from schizophrenia and various psychotic disorders, he becomes aware of the ways in which these folks seem to be living in household situations that were extremely difficult for them. And he tried to find a way, how can I go into this and examine this in a way that will unpack it for me, in a way that will be rigorous, that will be scientifically sound.
Yeah.
And he learns about what Gregory Bateson's doing in Palo Alto, who's
Right.
working with game theory. And he says, let me apply it. Let me create matrices for understanding family dynamics. And he goes in and he starts looking at family dynamics in basically ethnographically. And he does these elaborate surveys that people are taking to unpack family dynamics. And what he concludes on the basis of that is that not just that family dynamics are really a game of basically power and authority, that people are acting strategically, right? When they do all sorts of things, including when they're invoking love or anything like that. But that, more to the point, they're not aware of it. They're playing games that they know they're games being played, but nobody's talking about the games. And moreover, as he starts to discover when he deals with schizophrenic patients, is an awareness that you're in a game and you don't even know what the rules are. The rules seemingly changing on you, and and other people seem to be in charge of that. That's when he starts to say and explore this idea that one of the things that really reinforces the difficult psychiatric situation that people find themselves in are these dynamics, interpersonal dynamics here. Now we can look back on it now and we can make a point, right? And I think you and I might agree on this. Well, maybe not. We'll see. But you can make the point that, well, if you create a matrix of game theory approach to the family dynamic, maybe the kind of power plays you're talking about are an artifact of the instrument you're using to measure. You created a game when there maybe wasn't a game because you mapped it as a game. But in any event, it does allow Lang and people he worked with to really start to see the family, for instance, in a very different light than most people wanted to present it back in the 1960s.
That's fascinating. I think, and that's very useful. The prism that then shapes your understanding of what's going on, right? So that game theoretic modes of thought become a prism through which to understand something, but actually also shapes what's going on. Not only helps you understand, but it shapes the phenomena itself. So these prisms that are used now, as you point out in the family context, is sort of center stage in international relations around the question of nuclear weaponry. And one of the lines of protest, which was not sparked necessarily by Claude Eatherly, but certainly he becomes a sort of lightning rod for it, was that society is nuts, is mad. To have a society built and supportive of a regime of devices whose only purpose is mass murder and potentially the end of human life as we know it, is such an insane proposition that it does not deserve much more than simply protest. And so this notion that society is mad and the only sane reaction to it is what Eatherly is trying to do. Let me go and rob a couple of post offices to make people aware of how crazy we are, or society is. I think that's where what you said earlier I'd like to bring back in. Institutional ways in which madness or disorders are policed, the purposes they serve, and the self-recognition. Because Eatherly himself says, or suggests that, yeah, I'm mad. This is a bit much. As a way to seek the protection, if you want, of not being called a traitor, but rather sick, right? It's a less worrisome, and personally you have to deal with less when you're sick rather than a traitor.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether in the frame of society is mad, the reaction to a mad society is protest, but now on the condition that you're named as mad. Who's doing the naming? And is there some level at which there's complicity in accepting that label?
Right. And this again was historically something that has been discussed and debated within the whole circles and milieus surrounding psychiatry already, I think, in the 1950s, but certainly in the 1960s. So right around this time that you're talking about, in which this play takes place. Again, Lang is a great example of it for one person who makes this argument, because after he does this work, he then makes a similar argument that the world, the modern world, and the doom that hangs over people due to things like nuclear holocaust and all these human rights abuses that are going on at the time, all of these things really lead one to say that, you've got to question where the sanity and the insanity lies in society. And his argument is going to be that for many people, psychotic states are actually forms in ways in which people are going to be able to recover their sense of authorship of their lives, recover their sense of authenticity. And so he's going to go in a kind of more apolitical direction. He really moves his career into a more mystical kind of direction, ends up going overseas and goes to India and Tibet and places to study Eastern religions. Another example, however, would be the political route that I think you're discussing, would be the famous psychiatrist and political activist Frantz Fanon.
Right.
Fanon, from Martinique, studies psychiatry in France, starts working a lot with patients who are migrant workers from North Africa. And as he works with them, he finds they suffer from all these ailments, and he starts trying to treat these ailments, which keep coming up and over again. And he starts to say to himself, I'm really part of the problem, aren't I? Therapy, right, is basically saying, accommodate yourself to the situation you're in. And he starts to say, I realize that they don't need psychiatry, they need power. They need to change society. They need the economy of all this needs to change. The power structure needs to change. And I, as a psychiatrist, am not only giving them a Band-Aid to put over these huge gaping wounds in their whole sense of being, I'm actually keeping this thing alive. So what Fanon ends up doing is saying, I give it up. I'm leaving psychiatry. I'm becoming a political activist. I'm supporting the Algerian Revolution, and becomes a very vocal anti-colonialist, right? So that is an example in this Cold War setting of somebody who says the only way forward is to reject this label, right? Lang provides another version, but you do see this kind of pushback against this idea at the time. Yeah,
that's fascinating, because in fact that would be the fulcrum at which I think we can discuss what Italy intimates is precisely what you have described as Lang versus Fanon in a way, in this sense. Take as a proposition that the claim is one has to accommodate oneself to society. And the presumption now is that society is mad, that the conditions in society are unlivable, whether in a micro scale it is the economic structures that make you migrant workers situations, or more macroscopically, you're living in a world where the entire world could go up in flames. Right? Italy debates within himself, what does it mean to be a real hero? Does it mean to go down the path of political activism and agitate, as he's enjoined to do by people like Gunther Anders, the philosopher? Or, and he says this explicitly, or should I withdraw and try and live quietly, but with the knowledge of this crazy condition?
Hmm.
That is to say, be a silent witness.
Yeah.
It is not to give up witnessing, but be silent, as opposed to political activism. I think he raises that as two modes in which to negotiate, to live in, to deal with what one finds difficult to accommodate oneself to.
Yeah.
And I wondered with your, I think the frame of Lang and Fanon very suggestive, but I wondered with your even deeper understanding of the 20th century and some of the horrors that we've lived through, whether your thoughts from within the world of psychiatry or generally about political activism, the a kind of silent witnessing. Because I think my concern is this, and let me end there and leave it to you. What can be possibly said about countries having enough nuclear weapons to blow up the earth, X number hundreds of times over? Is this discussable? Is this rational? Debatable?
Yeah. It raises a number of different questions. I mean, one of the things I would say that I certainly think it would be the case with Lang and maybe Fanon is to make the point that to say the world is crazy, the world is insane, to say that political activism or more sort of looking inward approach is a positive or a natural response to this insanity. This is also not to say that an individual in question might in fact still be suffering from a psychiatric disorder. And I think one of the things that both of those figures kind of insisted on is the statement that's being made is that it doesn't matter because what they are doing is meaningful. And that's the important thing, is the meaning of their actions are meaningful. Do not dismiss them as and reduce them to a psychiatric pathological state. They are human beings who are trying to understand and make meaning in their lives and need to take that seriously. And that I think is interesting. So it's not a question of saying, who's insane, which side. It all might be true in that sense. So I think that's one of the interesting things. The other question, of course, is you're right. From the perspective of the 20th century, the perspective of this time period, it is very hard for people not to look at that time and to say to themselves, what on earth can one individual do? In the face of looking at two cataclysmic total wars, World War I and World War II, in the face of the initiation of now several genocides, and now looking at two superpowers who are seem to be hell-bent on destroying not just themselves, but the rest of the world, it becomes very, very difficult for people to say, what can I do? What is my role in all of this? And I think there is no question that this is part of what informs the philosophy of existentialism at the time, of how can I be the author of my own project, as existentialism often talked about it. It's also, I think it is also something in which some people turn to religion to find inspiration, to find their voice. And you see that in people like certainly Reinhold Niebuhr in his theological writings tries to explore this. What can I do as an individual that contributes in some ways to not just understanding this, but hopefully in some sense making some sort of difference? It is a terrible, terrible fate to be in, and it's one that I think today here in the 21st century is pretty familiar with it to us. Right? We know this. Many of us feel the same way today.
Yeah. So I think what Mary's play and Mary does with her play is to bring us to exactly this point, among the other things, bring us to this point of being acutely aware of sort of being thrust into a fate of recognizing, on the one hand, there's very little one can do, but on the other hand, feeling obliged to do something, one way or the other. That is to say, to continue to search for meaning. What is the meaning of the stuff, of the actions and the activities I conduct, and the way I think and the way I relate? Some of these larger phenomena, nuclear bombs, for example, put into question or make us do a lot more work trying to figure out meaning in our own actions. Yeah. I think that's a very disquieting but potent sort of summary of where we have come to as a culture, if you want, as a condition.
Yeah, it becomes. You would use the term at some point, I think, heroic. It's very hard to understand what heroic, what heroism would look like in this environment in which these inexorable forces that are so much larger than one tiny, isolated, lonely individual, what one can do that has any meaning in that kind of situation and setting. And so, as you see, in the 20th century, the answer to that question came in many forms. There are people who decided to sacrifice their lives. I think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany, this amazing man who deeply, profoundly religious, who gets away and is in the United States when the Nazis take over and decides the only place I can be is in Nazi Germany.
Right.
That's where I will prove.
Last stand.
Other people will turn to what's called, internal migration, right? In which you just simply say, I'm going to keep my head down, survive this so that I can continue the fight later on. Other people say, I'm going to make small little gestures of resistance in my life. There's all sorts of possibilities. And so this kind of issue here, and it seems to me that part of what this play is about is, in fact, in part, it looks at somebody who seems to be, at least on the surface, to be exploring that kind of repertoire about what might be meaningful under those circumstances.
That's brilliant, Greg. I think we should quit while we are ahead. That line, which, the line at which you ended, the repertoire of exploring the repertoire of figuring out how to find meaning, is brilliant. And so I wanted to thank you very much. And I hope these COVID years or days will pass and we can break bread again together. If not before the play, then surely at the play. I believe it is March 30th and 31st.
Sounds great.
Thanks. Lovely. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you.
See you soon.